The ranch lay in the quiet of early dawn, dry wind rattling the skeletal branches of mesquite trees, and the sun barely touching the horizon with a sickly orange glow. For decades, it had been a place of solitude, a buffer against the chaos of the outer territories. But that morning, the silence was fractured. From the ridge, Thomas Mercer squinted through the heat haze, the silhouette of a girl swinging faintly against a twisted limb, her small body rigid. A crude sign, scrawled in harsh black ink, dangled below her, "White man don't forgive." His pulse hammered in his ears. The world had shifted in an instant. The ordinary ranch he had tended for years was now the stage of an unspoken war. Thomas was no stranger to danger. Though most of it had been predictable, bandits, raiders, or the occasional drone patrol lost from the neighboring military outpost. What hung in that tree, however, was a puzzle of brutality and intent. He checked his comm, voice low and urgent. "Mercer here. Command, I've got a civilian possible hostile message. Coordinates ... He trailed off as a sudden flicker of movement caught his eye. The girl's head tilted slightly, eyes tracking him through the dusty morning light. There was fear, but also a glint of something sharper defiance. Across the valley, Captain Alara Voss adjusted the optics on her modified reconnaissance suit. Her fingers were steady despite the tension in her shoulders, but the sweat along her spine reminded her how vulnerable the human body remained, even with the exoskeletal support rigs strapped tight. She'd been briefed on the region's insurgent activity, the tribal skirmishes that occasionally spilled over into civilian areas, and the reports of new technology, the rail-mounted plasma harpoons, the automated drones that had begun patrolling no man's land. And yet, nothing in her tactical simulations had prepared her for a tableau like this. A low buzz drew her attention to the edge of the ridge. One of her field drones, a small quadrilateral with reinforced composite plating, hovered silently, telemetry streaming images to her HUD. The girl's eyes had widened. Her hands flexed and unflexed against the rope that cut cruelly across her wrists. Voss's chest tightened. "This is beyond an ambush," she muttered, scanning the surrounding terrain. The placement was deliberate. The tree itself provided near-perfect concealment for the approach of any hostile units. Whoever had left her here had counted on the rancher or anyone who stumbled into the scene hesitating. Calculating, afraid. Mercer moved closer, boots crunching in the dry loam. His rifle was slung at a low ready, though the weight felt more ceremonial than functional in the heat of the moment. He studied the sign again, trying to gauge motive. "White man don't forgive," it read. The phrasing suggested vengeance, but not indiscriminate. It hinted at a message, a warning. And somewhere in that warning was a vector he had to understand before making a move. He crouched slightly, observing. Around the base of the tree, the ground had been scuffed recently, and faint imprints suggested more than one pair of boots had passed here. This was no random act. It was a message, and he was its intended audience. Alara Voss activated the suit's adaptive optics, mapping heat signatures across the ridge. One signature lingered just beyond the tree line, a barely perceptible movement, almost like a predator testing its prey. She keyed her comm. "Mercer, whatever you do, don't approach alone. You've got hostiles nearby. I'm looping in a sensor drone to mark their positions. Keep your movements predictable." "Predictable." Mercer smirked grimly, though he didn't reply out loud. Predictability was a trap he knew well. He edged closer, shifting laterally, keeping low, every sense tuned to the environment. The girl's gaze followed him, and he thought he detected recognition, not trust, but acknowledgement that he wasn't another executioner. He raised a gloved hand slightly, just a gesture of reassurance, and the girl mirrored it tentatively. Behind the ridge, Lieutenant Harun Cade checked the feed from his reconnaissance skimmer. The desert heat had been baking sensors all night, but the feed came through crisp, revealing a subtle pattern in the footprints, small disturbances in the sand, and a faint glint of something metallic caught under the morning sun. "They're watching," he said softly into the mic, his tone clipped. "Not from here. They're elevated, maybe on the next ridge, sniper-class optics. And it's automated, not human, motion activated." Voss's jaw tightened. Automated overwatch in combination with human intent that meant whoever set this up had thought 2 steps ahead. Mercer had to act quickly, but carefully. She keyed her come again. "I'll guide you." Eyes on all potential lines of fire. Minimal exposure. Do not engage unless necessary. "Copy?" Mercer nodded once. He couldn't respond vocally. The girl might interpret it wrongly. Step by step, he advanced, careful not to dislodge the heat-sensing wires that Cade had triangulated. The rope holding the girl creaked slightly, and her small body tensed. "Steady," he whispered under his breath, though the wind carried the sound away. Halfway through the approach, Mercer froze. The ground beneath the distant mesquite quivered, not naturally, not wind. A small kinetic device, buried barely under the sand, triggered a faint shimmer in the heat-sensing overlay. Mercer's heart leapt into his throat. Improvised kinetic traps. The insurgent calculus was cold: delay, intimidate, and test his reaction. He motioned, staying low, drawing the girl's attention to the cover of a larger boulder. Her eyes followed, wide and cautious. Voss's voice broke through the cum's static, calm but insistent. "Mercer, there's a second device near the base of the tree. I've marked it. Move diagonally, use the shadow of the ridge." "You have 20 seconds." Mercer calculated. 20 seconds, just enough to keep forward momentum, but too little for hesitation. He shifted, each muscle tense, his body a steady and controlled motion. The girl mirrored his movement instinctively, small and precise, trusting his lead even without understanding the strategy behind it. Step by step, they closed the distance. The sign, swinging in the slight breeze, seemed almost to taunt him. Each letter a reminder of the danger and message, "White man don't forgive." As they reached the tree, Mercer's rifle swept the surrounding terrain. The shadow of the ridge concealed a glint sniper optics catching the first rays of dawn. He felt the heat of the automated sighting, the precision. One false move and the girl could die, the message delivered in full. He crouched, hand over the girl's tiny wrist, cutting the rope swiftly with a reinforced multi-tool. She fell into his arms, trembling, and for a fraction of a second, the sun illuminated her dirt-streaked face. The defiance in her eyes remained, a spark amid the fear, but before he could exhale, a shrill whine split the air. A kinetic drone, almost invisible against the rising sun, zipped toward them. Mercer rolled with the girl into a shallow depression in the earth. Sand and rock sprayed, and for an instant, the world was a blur of motion and static. Voss shouted through the comm, relaying coordinates and firing solutions. "Suppress now. I've got a clear shot." Mercer's hand shook only slightly as he raised the rifle, sighting along the trajectory Voss had dictated. 1 pulse, 2 pulse, 3. The drone faltered and crashed into the mesquite saplings behind. Static hummed briefly over the comm as Cade relayed data. "They've adapted. More drones inbound. This is not a random attack. They're organized, tactical." The girl whimpered softly, clutching Mercer's shoulder. He looked down at her, breathing hard, realizing that this encounter was not a singular act of malice. It was an opening gambit, a probe into his reflexes, his capacity to protect, and his ability to think under pressure. The sign, the hanging, the drones, it was all part of a calculus. A communication from an enemy who understood strategy, patience, and intimidation. Mercer's jaw set. "We adapt," he murmured. "We survive. And we strike back on our terms." The girl, small but unwavering, nodded faintly. She had been a pawn, but perhaps she could become an ally. Beyond the ridge, unseen eyes recalculated. They had underestimated the human element, courage, improvisation, the stubborn refusal to yield. The game had begun, and Mercer, Voss, and Cade understood one immutable truth. The enemy had delivered a message, and the response would be just as deliberate and far more lethal. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and danger. Mercer rose slowly, the girl in his arms, scanning the horizon. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the insurgent network adjusted, plotting the next move. And in that fleeting moment, a single pulse of kinetic energy whispered across the valley, striking a distant boulder. A warning, a test. Mercer's teeth clenched. He didn't yet know, but he did know this. The war for survival had just begun, and failure was not an option. The sun rose higher, baking the desert ridge with relentless intensity, and Mercer's muscles ached from the adrenaline still coiling through his body. The girl clung to him, silent but watchful, her small hands gripping the reinforced vest of his exosuit. He could feel her tension, the way her body responded to every faint movement in the heat-warped horizon. Somewhere beyond the ridges, hidden by the mirage of rising heat and dust, their unseen adversaries were recalculating. Mercer knew instinctively this was no random ambush. It was a probe, a study in patience and perception, a test of reaction under stress. Voss's voice crackled through the cum, precise and measured. Mercer, get to the secondary cover. I've mapped a path through the thermals. You'll encounter a minefield of kinetic triggers, but if you follow the shadow gradient, you'll stay below detection threshold. Cade and I will provide overwatch. Proceed slowly. He adjusted the girl in his arms, noting the abrasions along her wrists and the dirt crusted into her hair. She hadn't spoken, not yet, and he didn't push. Words were unnecessary. Their communication was through gestures and instincts, the silent understanding of survival. He began moving, each step calculated, as Cade's sensors relayed minor heat fluctuations and telemetry of approaching threats. The desert air shimmered with more than heat. It pulsed with the anticipation of unseen eyes, Lieutenant. Harn Cade squatted behind a jagged boulder 30 meters above the ridge. His suit's optics trolled through layers of spectral and kinetic overlays, filtering out heat blooms and minor disturbances. The enemy's network was sophisticated triangulated observation points, automated microdrones with adaptive optics, and sensor jamming fields that flickered intermittently. But Cade was methodical. He could detect the pattern in their rotation, the pulse of their observation sweeps, and he began feeding real-time corrections to Mercer via encrypted comm. 2 microdrones on your flank, 22 meters apart, Cade murmured, eyes narrowing. They rotate in synchronized arcs. Wait until their sweep passes, then move diagonally. Keep your line of sight low and avoid resonance with the sensor pulses. You have 30 seconds. Mercer nodded subtly, timing his breaths, adjusting the girl's grip, and moving in sync with the invisible rhythm Cade described. The rope swing from the earlier ambush had left faint traces, and Mercer realized that the enemy expected a predictable path. He deliberately broke pattern, veering sharply toward a rocky outcrop, forcing a recalculation. Behind him, a faint pop of displacement indicated one of the microdrones had misaligned. And for a heartbeat, Mercer felt a flicker of advantage. Voss adjusted her position, climbing the ridge with the silent efficiency of someone who had navigated worse terrains under worse odds. Her suit's servomotors hummed faintly as she stabilized atop a narrow ledge, the optics scanning the surrounding horizon in minute sweeps. Mercer, the girl's vitals are low, she said, noting the dehydration and exhaustion. Hydration pack in your pack. Keep her close, but don't break cover to administer. We don't know if there's a second minefield yet. The tension was a living thing. Every movement, every breath had consequences. Mercer's boots scuffed the sand just enough to trigger minor shifts in the heat signature, and he adjusted instinctively, rolling slightly when a faint kinetic pulse resonated nearby. He was moving not just to survive, but to learn, to gather the intel the enemy inadvertently left. In their pattern of aggression, they reached the secondary cover without incident, and Mercer let the girl slide to the ground, crouching behind a boulder with her pressed close. She finally spoke, voice low and wary. They watch, she said, the accent heavy, the words deliberate. Always watch. Mercer's jaw tightened. He offered no reply, letting her words settle. Voss, from her overwatch position, keyed her come. She's right. The sensors indicate 5 stationary observation points beyond the ridge. 2 of them are automated microsnipers. The rest are human. And judging by the placement, they're feeding live telemetry back to a central node, probably a mobilecom relay. Kate's voice interjected, calm but firm. We can't confront them head on. Too many unknowns. We need to isolate the relay and disrupt the telemetry flow. Minimal kinetic exposure, maximum tactical leverage. Mercer's eyes scanned the terrain. The relay would be lightly defended, mobile, and shielded, but he recognized the patterns from years of reading insurgent movements. The enemy relied on prediction algorithms that could be exploited with randomness, deception, and timing. He formulated a plan, noting the energy bursts on the overlay and the cadence of drone sweeps. I can move in small arcs, trigger decoys from the pack, then close in on the relay, he muttered. The girl, she stays here, hidden. Voss provides overwatch. Voss's voice crackled, clipped. Affirmative. But Mercer, if you're wrong, this is the endgame for both of you. No heroics. He didn't apply. Heroics had never been his style. Precision, calculation, and timing, those were his allies. The girl's hands trembled, and he offered a reassuring nod. We adapt, he whispered. We survive. Then we strike. As he moved, Voss relayed telemetry in real time. Small deviations, unexpected dust plumes, subtle shifts in microdrone behavior, each data point fed the improvisation Mercer had learned to trust. He triggered a minor decoy from his pack, a small kinetic flare that sent the nearest microdrone off its rotation arc. It whirred erratically, blinded momentarily, and Mercer slipped along a depression in the sand, closing distance to the mobile relay node, but the enemy's adaptation was swift. A kinetic pulse erupted from a secondary line, a concealed turret embedded in a rocky outcrop. Mercer dropped behind cover, scanning rapidly for weak points. The relay node, shielded with composite plating and energy dampeners, was vulnerable only at the vent grid, a small panel on the underside. If he could deploy an EMP microcharge precisely there, it would disrupt the telemetry for minutes, maybe enough to extract critical intel. He signaled Voss, timing the sequence with her optics. Ready for breach, he murmured. Kate's voice overlaid, calm and methodical. Wait for the second pulse to end, then lateral shift, deploy. We only get one attempt before auto reset. Mercer counted the seconds, muscles coiled. The girl crouched low, silent, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. He moved, rolling over sand and rock with meticulous precision, and placed the ME microcharge on the vent grid. The charge pulsed faintly, a nearly imperceptible shimmer across the surface. The telemetry feedback collapsed instantly, microdrones wobbling in erratic arcs. The human observers momentarily blinded by the disruption. A flicker of triumph passed across Mercer's eyes, but it was fleeting. The central cum node, he could see it in the distance, nestled atop a ridge, began a rapid recalibration, emitting a faint but distinct signal. The enemy wasn't defeated. They were adapting. And Mercer realized as the girl looked up at him with wide, cautious eyes that their struggle had only intensified. They withdrew to the secondary cover, the sun climbing higher and the desert heat pressing down. Mercer's palms were raw from the grip, muscles screaming from tension, but the girl was unharmed. Voss recalculated the sweeps, noting new thermal anomalies. Cade analyzed the residual patterns, tracing faint microbursts that suggested the enemy had anticipated an EMP countermeasure. They're learning. Voss muttered. Faster than we can predict. This isn't a simple ambush. It's an intelligence war. Every move we make, they adjust. Every countermeasure, they refine. They know we have constraints, ammunition, heat, fatigue, human limits. And they exploit it. Mercer nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. Then we have to force unpredictability, randomness, controlled chaos. Every calculated move has to be a decoy and a strike. The girl spoke again, voice trembling but clear. They come at night. Shadows move different. You cannot see. Cade frowned. The description fit the data they had been collecting. Nocturnal maneuvers, low-heat signatures, silent microdrones with adaptive optics. We'll need to adapt night ops protocols, he said. Suit overlays, thermal masking, silent kinetic approaches. We can't assume the day provides safety. Voss adjusted her optics, calculating exposure and shadow gradients. If we don't neutralize their relay nodes systematically, they'll keep probing, testing, escalating. And at night, without intervention, they could strike anywhere. The girl's warning, "White man don't forgive," wasn't just a message. It's doctrine. We've triggered it. Mercer's gaze swept the ridge lines. Somewhere in the distance, they could feel the enemy's calculation, the invisible pressure of observation. The girl shivered, pressing closer. He offered a hand, helping her stand. We're not done, he said. We fight smart. We fight precise. We survive to strike. The wind shifted, carrying a whisper of dust and distant kinetic energy. From the horizon, a shadow flickered, a pattern Mercer didn't immediately recognize. Voss keyed her come urgently. Multiple vectors. They're converging on the secondary ridge. Mercer, hold position. Cade, recalibrate defenses. This may be the first direct assault. The girl's eyes widened, and Mercer tightened his grip. The battle had escalated beyond simple probes or warnings. The enemy had adapted, calculated, and now the first skirmish of this unfolding conflict was about to hit them in full force. The ridge trembled faintly as kinetic charges triggered further down the valley. Mercer steadied himself, glancing at Voss and Cade. We've learned their pattern, he muttered. Now we test them with ours. A low hum vibrated through the ground, a signal of approaching drones, faster, more coordinated than before. Mercer's heart tightened, knowing that every second counted, and the enemy's real intent was only beginning to reveal itself. The girl whispered one word, almost inaudible over the rising tension, forgive. Mercer's jaw clenched. No, he said, voice steady. Not here. Not now. The first wave of the night assault descended, the desert suddenly alive with movement, shadows, and lethal intent. Every decision, every calculation, every small improvisation mattered now. Failure would not just be personal, it would be catastrophic. And Mercer, Voss, Cade, and the girl faced the truth. The war had entered a new, relentless phase. Night had fallen like a curtain over the ridge. The desert transformed into a labyrinth of shadows, jagged rocks, and whispering wind. Mercer crouched low behind a fractured outcrop. The girl pressed close against his chest, her small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The heat had faded, replaced by a biting chill that gnawed through even the exosuit's insulation. Voss hovered above on the ridge, her suit optics scanning in layers, thermal, motion, spectral. Every sweep revealed subtle movements, faint heat blooms, the pulse of enemy microdrones adapting in real time. The terrain was alive with potential danger, every ridge, hollow, and dune a line in the enemy's invisible diagram. Kate adjusted a handheld console, triangulating the residual signals from the earlier EMP strike. The relay node we disabled was a decoy. I traced the telemetry feed. Real node is 50 meters north, camouflaged with terrain masking. They've been feeding false data to lure us into exposure. His voice was flat, but the edge of tension betrayed the calculation of anger and surprise. We've underestimated them. That last probe wasn't just a test, it was bait. Mercer's jaw clenched. Then we turned bait into trap. Night assault, low signature. We move on their real node, disrupt the feed, and extract any intel stored locally. Timing is everything. Voss, Cade, your overwatch. Girl stays hidden. Voss's voice was calm, authoritative, as always. Copy. Visual on your path. Thermal masking active. Stay below 30% heat signature relative to ambient. Any deviation, and I neutralize their perimeter drones first. We don't engage humans unless unavoidable. The first steps were a study in patience. Mercer advanced slowly, rolling between shadows, pressing against ridges, calculating the arcs of potential microdrone sensors. Every small movement carried weight. A single misstep could trigger automated lethal response. The girl whispered occasionally, almost to herself, pointing to faint disturbances in sand traces left by patrols, microdrone landings, and human scouts. Mercer noted each with silent thanks. Her instincts, honed perhaps by fear and survival, were a precise dot as they reached the approach to the real relay node. Cade's console buzzed with sudden input. 2 human sentries, 3 automated observation drones. They're using adaptive camouflage nearly invisible to spectral optics. They shift patterns every 10 seconds. Any engagement has to be precise. We don't have the luxury of error. Mercer adjusted his rifle, checking the heat bloom of the barrel against his HUD. Ammo was limited. Every round accounted for, and he calculated. A suppression shot to one drone, kinetic pulse to the other, and a brief EMP overlay to blind the sentries temporarily. He signaled Voss. She acknowledged, her optics locking onto the nodes. The first strike was surgical. Mercer fired a single pulse from a modified railgun, striking the nearest drone's propulsion coil. Sparks flew, and the drone wobbled before crashing into the sand. A second pulse from a micro-AMP module disabled the remaining observation drones for seconds, just enough. The sentry's human reacted late, scanning with delayed recognition. Mercer rolled forward, covering the girl's movement toward low boulder cover. The relay node rose ahead, camouflaged with reflective sand panels, energy shielding faintly glowing under the spectral overlay. Mercer approached cautiously, noting the small kinetic disruptors along the periphery tripwires and automated turrets poised to react within milliseconds. He deployed a micro-decoy metallic fragments that mimicked heat signatures and slipped into the shadow. Cade whispered through cum. Thermal sweep shows 3 more hidden nodes feeding into the relay. Data cache likely encrypted. You'll need a bypass module. Mercer knelt, unpacking a compact device with delicate wires, carefully interfacing with the vent panel. Sparks danced faintly, then the hum of the node shifted. Data extraction commenced, a slow stream of encrypted logs, operational maps, movement patterns, and predictive algorithms. The enemy had planned meticulously, microdrone patrols, kinetic traps, night ambush routines. Every byte of this data was a roadmap to their methods. But the risk of being discovered escalated by the second. Voss's voice cut through, tension underlying her usually calm tone. Mercer, movement detected ridgeline north. Additional hostiles inbound, likely patrol sweep. You've got less than 90 seconds to finish extraction. Mercer's hands moved swiftly, modules connecting, wires snaking through the vent grid. The girl crouched behind him, still silent, eyes wide and alert. Sweat coated his brow, heart hammering, mind calculating contingencies. If the extraction completed, they could cripple the enemy's coordination for hours, enough to establish a foothold, to plan further strikes. If they failed, exposure meant death. The device beeped faintly, confirming partial decryption. Mercer frowned. Partial only. Looks like they used a dynamic key matrix. I can get segments, but full access will take longer than we have. Cade interjected urgently. Abort or be trapped. They've deployed perimeter lockdowns. Extraction isn't safe beyond 30 seconds. Voss, what's your visual? Voss scanned and whispered, they're closing fast. Automated sentries plus 2 human units converging from Ridge North. Mercer, pull back, partial intel is still usable. We can exploit gaps later. Don't risk capture. Reluctantly, Mercer disengaged, retrieving the girl and backtracking along the shadows. The node's partial decryption already yielded troop rotation patterns, energy allocation schedules, and predictive drone movement algorithms. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to plan an offensive dot as they moved toward secondary cover. A sudden flare lit the sky. A third-party unit unaccounted for had crossed the valley using terrain masking. Mercer's eyes caught the glint of a comm device strapped to the newcomer's wrist. Recognition struck like a bullet. One of their supposed allies embedded with the enemy, feeding live telemetry. Betrayal. Voss's voice, tight with urgency, cut through comm. Mercer, Northridge. Sniper-class optics. Unidentified unit. Thermal pattern shows human signature consistent with field liaison. They're transmitting live feed. Abort immediate. Extract girl to fallback. Mercer's teeth clenched. They had been compromised, their movements monitored, their previous MC strike anticipated. He adjusted quickly, lateral shift along shadowed sand, rolling into the depression with the girl pressed tight. Cade's console overlaid heat signatures, confirming the feed, a betrayal that left them vulnerable, yet also revealed enemy positioning. The infiltrator, clearly familiar with their standard protocols, was using their own tactics against them, predicting moves, feeding data in real time. Mercer realized the enemy hadn't acted purely with brute force. They had been exploiting human predictability. This betrayal magnified the danger exponentially as the night deepened. Kinetic pulses began triggering along adjacent ridges tripwires, microcharge bursts, and faint flashes from distant turrets. Mercer rolled and sprinted in measured bursts, the girl ducking low, body pressed against his chest. Voss coordinated suppressive interference, deploying faint impulses to disorient microdrones and disrupt the relay feedback. Cade recalculated every second, mapping blind spots and potential traps. The betrayal meant the enemy now had live data on their fallback positions. Every decision carried lethal weight. Mercer forced himself to breathe evenly, calculating odds. A straight retreat risked detection. Flanking left exposed them to kinetic mines. Right was monitored. He created a false vector, doubling back under the ridge's shadow, drawing the enemy's sensors away from the girl's path. Suddenly, a sharp snap echoed, a tripwire triggered. Kinetic pulse striking a rock near the girl, sending sand spraying. She cried out, startled. Mercer grabbed her instinctively, rolling her out of range. The infiltrator's voice, faint but unmistakable through comm interception, hissed, "You can't hide." Data feeds live. Every move tracked. Resistance is futile. Mercer's stomach twisted. The human element, the betrayal, was as deadly as the mechanical systems. Yet he refused panic. "We adapt," he muttered, pressing a small decoy pulse to create false heat signatures. The enemy sensors flickered, confused, and Mercer seized the moment. Sprinting along the shadow gradient, Cade calculated escape arcs, feeding Mercer a sequence of micro-suppression points and thermal masking windows. Voss provided cover from the ridge, firing non-lethal kinetic pulses to disrupt sensor arrays without triggering lethal retaliation. Together, the improvisation, coordination, and relentless discipline allowed them to extract the girl from the immediate kill zone. Breathing hard, Mercer ducked into a shallow canyon. The girl pressed close, exhausted but unharmed. The betrayal lingered in every movement. The infiltrator could strike again, could anticipate next steps. Mercer realized the war had changed. The enemy was no longer merely reactive. They were predictive, adaptive, and human a mirror of his own tactical skill. Yet in the extracted partial intel lay a spark of hope. They now had insight into troop rotations, drone algorithms, and resource allocations. But the night was far from over. Somewhere north, the infiltrator had disappeared into darkness, leaving a cold, clear warning the next engagement would be inevitable. And stakes had never been higher. The girl looked up at Mercer, whispering again, "They forgive nothing, neither man nor mistake." Mercer's gaze hardened. "Then we make them pay with precision, not panic." And we survived this night. The canyon swallowed them in shadows, but the echo of betrayal followed like a predator. Every pulse of wind a reminder. The enemy had learned, adapted, and now controlled the tempo. The next move had to be theirs, or the cost would be unimaginable. The first light of dawn was a pale, cold sliver over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert canyon. Mercer and the girl crouched behind the fractured boulder that had been their refuge for the night. The betrayal lingered like a ghost, every motion. Every decision had to factor in the unknown observer, the infiltrator embedded with the enemy. Cade scrolled through the partial intel, marking probable staging points, sensor arrays, and supply nodes. Voss had moved to the northern ridge, adjusting her optics to account for shifting thermal conditions and early sunlight reflections. Mercer flexed his fingers, his rifle resting lightly against his forearm, every movement deliberate. The girl had slept fitfully, still trembling with exhaustion, but now her eyes tracked every motion, every subtle hint of wind or shadow. She had learned, silently, from him and Voss, the language of survival. Mercer glanced down, acknowledging her focus with a nod. He had come to understand that the girl was not just a victim of circumstance. She was a participant in this emerging tactical ecosystem, instinctive and alert. Voss, Mercer whispered into the comm, confirmed the North Ridge coverage. "Are the microdrones still active?" "They're flickering," she responded, voice clipped but steady. "I've overlaid an M pattern to keep the signals scrambled intermittently. They're probing, but the pattern confuses the automation. Any further movement, and they'll be blinded for seconds enough for us to stage." Cade's console flickered. Enemy reinforcement patterns indicate they're converging on a secondary sensor hub to the east, roughly 300 meters. It's lightly defended, but the approach corridor is narrow lines of sight, perfect for kinetic traps and automated snipers. If we hit it, we can disrupt the east flank and divide their response. But timing is critical. The girl stays out of the corridor. Mercer nodded, scanning the terrain mentally. The east ridge was jagged, dotted with sandstone outcrops, natural depressions, and subtle wind channels. These would be vital for concealment, thermal masking, and kinetic diversion. He calculated movement arcs, lateral shifts to avoid predictable heat signatures, decoy pulses to mislead automated targeting, and staggered timing windows that maximized exposure to cover ratios. The plan was risky, but it leveraged environmental physics rather than brute force. He looked down at the girl. "We move on my signal?" Eyes on shadows, breathe steady and trust the rhythm. She nodded, faint but resolute. The operation began with a calculated chaos. Mercer deployed a series of reflective micro-decoys, each mimicking heat signatures of both him and the girl. The decoys rolled along slight inclines, triggering automated sensors, drawing pulses away from their true path. Voss monitored from the ridge, guiding Mercer and Cade with precise overlays, suggesting minute lateral shifts to avoid residual thermal traces. Cade manipulated portable jamming arrays, creating micro-intervals of sensor blindness that opened narrow windows of approach dot as they approached the east corridor. The narrow path became a gauntlet. Mercer detected a kinetic tripwire embedded in sandstone, nearly invisible against the natural texture. He triggered a controlled micropulse to neutralize it, but the vibration rippled slightly, sending faint kinetic waves along the ground. Mercer froze. Seconds later, a thermal flicker betrayed a human sentry hidden behind an outcrop. The man's optics glinted faintly. Mercer rolled laterally, bringing the girl down into a shallow depression, and fired a single pulse into the rock, a controlled kinetic discharge meant to stun, not kill. The sentry dropped, shielded by the outcrop, and Mercer advanced in the temporary blind window created by the kinetic disruption. Voss overlaid live telemetry, noting the thermal hotspots emerging from the secondary, rich automated microdrones, deploying in erratic patterns. The corridor ended at a low saddle between two sandstone cliffs. There, the enemy's secondary sensor hub pulsed faintly, energy shielding flickering as automated calibrations adjusted to the environment. Mercer signaled Voss, prepare suppression. Her pulse-modulated M-burst detonated across the saddle, overloading the hub's optical sensors for a critical 4-second interval. Mercer sprinted, rolling into a shallow depression at the hub's base. The relay panel required careful manipulation. Mercer deployed a small extraction interface, bypassing encrypted logs with precision. Data streamed slowly into his portable module, predictive patrol patterns, drone deployment rotations, and a dynamic prioritization matrix. Cade monitored for interference, confirming that the extraction process remained stable despite intermittent sensor pulses from distant nodes. Suddenly, a movement flickered on the northern ridge. Mercer recognized the silhouette immediately. It was the infiltrator, moving with calculated precision, clearly intending to strike or warn the enemy. Mercer cursed under his breath. They had anticipated night probes, daytime exposure, even kinetic traps, but the human factor remained unpredictable. Voss, Mercer whispered, engage distraction protocol. Use suppressed kinetic pulses non-lethal. Force deviation. Delay their line of sight. Voss's M overlay pulsed, micropulses striking hidden sensors. The infiltrator shifted, correcting his vector. Mercer pressed the girl against the sandstone, shielding her as he completed the extraction. Data confirmed critical nodes, energy allocations, and predictive algorithms that would allow the team to divide enemy forces and exploit weaknesses. But the infiltrator adapted quickly. A sudden whistle of air, the faint hum of rail-accelerated projectiles slicing close, signaled intent to engage. Mercer assessed. No direct line of escape, the corridor exposed, and collateral danger to the girl. He made a decision, sacrificed temporal exposure to protect her. Forcing the enemy into a predictable interception, Mercer triggered a controlled diversion, detonating micro-EMP pulses along the ridge's periphery. Automated drones faltered, sentries shifted position, and the infiltrator's optics shimmered briefly. Mercer sprinted, rolling the girl into the final depression near the sandstone saddle. The infiltrator fired, rail pulses striking the ground inches from Mercer, dislodging stone fragments and throwing sand into the air. Mercer returned fire not lethal, but precise targeting energy optics and feed units. The infiltrator faltered, Signaling retreat, they had forced the human agent into temporary withdrawal, but Mercer knew this was only a delay. The infiltrator would adapt, learn, and strike again. He compressed the girl against his chest, scanning for residual threats. Cade confirmed, no immediate detection, but residual thermal trails indicated reinforcements moving toward the saddle. Mercer realized the operation had come at a cost. Every second of success exacted a physical toll. His muscles burned. The exosuit servos strained from continuous micro-adjustments, and his respiration was shallow but controlled. The girl was exhausted, face pale, eyes wide but alert. Voss's overlay confirmed partial suppression of enemy nodes, but full neutralization required a follow-up offensive. The team moved quickly along lateral ridges, using terrain masking, shadows, and thermal gradients to conceal their withdrawal. Mercer paused briefly, hands on knees, scanning the horizon. The infiltrator's figure had disappeared into early morning haze, but Mercer's mind worked in calculated loops. They now knew he had the girl, partial intel, and had disrupted one secondary node. The enemy's next move was predictable in terms of aggression, but unpredictable in method. Voss. Cade, Mercer muttered, voice low but firm. We regroup at the western ridge. Establish fallback and extraction. The infiltrator will attempt re-engagement. Prepare countermeasures traps, suppressive decoys, and synchronized pulses. Timing will be everything. Voss adjusted optics, scanning distant slopes. Understood. Deploying micro-decoys. Will mask your vector. Cade, feed intervals on automated node recalibrations. We need at least 6 minutes before they reassert control. As they approached the western ridge, a soft whistle of wind carried an unnatural tone, the faint hum of rail pulse energy in the distance. Mercer froze. The infiltrator's presence returned, not attacking directly but observing, recalculating. Mercer's eyes met the girl's. Her small hand gripped his vest. They forgive nothing, she whispered again. Mercer's jaw tightened. He realized the truth. This operation had been partially successful, but the infiltrator had learned, adapted, and was now controlling tempo from shadows. They had disrupted nodes, gathered intel, and forced deviation, but the enemy still held the initiative in subtle ways. The canyon, the ridges, the desert all became instruments of engagement, not merely terrain. He rose slowly, scanning the horizon. We've taken the first step, he said, voice low but resolute. But the real fight, the multi-vector strike, the final manipulation comes next. And someone may not make it. The girl's eyes widened, but she nodded faintly. Mercer knew the personal stakes had become intertwined with the tactical. Lives, trust, and sacrifice now macheted with data streams and suppressive pulses. The infiltrator had forced their hand, and the next engagement would demand total coordination, cunning, and the willingness to risk everything for survival. The desert lay silent for a heartbeat. Then the faint shimmer of distant drones marked the approach of enemy reinforcements. Mercer glanced at Voss and Cade. Every member of this fragile alliance understood the calculus, precision. Coordination and sacrifice would decide the coming clash, and somewhere in the shadows, the infiltrator watched, anticipating the next move. The stakes had never been higher, and the final confrontation loomed closer than anyone realized. The desert was stripped to shades of gray under a pale morning sun. Mercer adjusted the girl against his chest, her small frame trembling yet steady, eyes scanning every shadow. The previous night's operations had been a trial in endurance, improvisation, and raw instinct. Every misstep, every slight miscalculation had been magnified by the infiltrator's cunning. Now, the final assault loomed, the enemy's core leverage point, a fortified command node controlling micro-drone arrays, kinetic turrets, and predictive sensor networks. Failure was not an option. Voss hovered silently on the ridge above, suit optics sweeping in layered spectral filters, mapping the enemy network in real time. Cade crouched in a crevice beside Mercer, fingers flying over his portable console, calculating probabilities of detection, reaction times, and optimal angles for engagement. The girl remained silent, gripping Mercer's vest, her small hands a reminder of why precision mattered more than aggression. Coordinates locked, Cade murmured. The node is nestled between two ridges, shielded with adaptive energy plating. Direct assault is suicidal. We need multi-vector infiltration, lateral diversion, decoy sweeps, thermal masking, and timed micro-EMP bursts. All synchronized. Mercer's jaw set. We adapt. We strike together. No improvisation this time, everything pre-calculated. He glanced at the girl. She nodded faintly, understanding instinctively the gravity. This was no longer just survival. It was strategy turned lethal. Without chaos, but with all human risk intact, the plan began with Mercer deploying micro-decoys across the eastern flank, mimicking their thermal and kinetic signatures. Each decoy triggered automated turrets and microdrones, forcing the enemy to react along a false vector. Simultaneously, Voss fired precision AA impulses across the northern ridge, creating intermittent blindness in sensor networks and short-circuiting feed loops. Cade's console displayed predictive arcs, advising Mercer of safe windows and optimal cover paths. Mercer sprinted along a depression in the sand, the girl pressed tight against his chest. Every step calculated, every breath synchronized to avoid micro-vibrations that could trigger hidden sensors. Small kinetic pulses from his suit countered residual ground vibrations. The enemy fired intermittently rail pulses slicing near rocks, but the decoy strategy had pulled major automated defenses away. They reached the first ridge undetected. Mercer glanced back. Voss's suppressed pulses had kept the infiltrator distracted, momentarily immobilized by cascading sensor failures. Cade's overlays showed thermal gaps in the secondary ridge, openings in the enemy network. We have 6 seconds of clear window, he whispered. Mercer crouched, cutting a small vent panel on the node's shield. Sparks flickered faintly. The protective plating hissed under the interference. Data streams began flowing, patrol rotations, turret cycles, energy allocations, even hidden caches of weapons and microdrone ammunition. Mercer knew that controlling this node meant controlling the enemy's tempo. Suddenly, a flicker from the northern ridge, a figure emerging from shadow. The infiltrator. He had recalculated, predicting Mercer's path. A rail pulse struck near Mercer, dislodging sand and throwing off his balance. He pressed the girl down into a shallow depression, shielding her as his gloved hand triggered a suppressed kinetic pulse at the infiltrator's feed device. Sparks flew. The transmission faltered. Voss adjusted optics, firing impulses to maintain sensor blindness. Cade's overlays indicated residual vulnerabilities. Mercer realized they could isolate the infiltrator physically. The terrain funneled him toward the southern ridge, away from critical nodes. Timing was everything. Mercer whispered to Cade, "Ready a lure. Make him chase the false signature." Cade activated a series of synchronized micro-decoys, creating a heat signature that the infiltrator could not ignore. The human agent, driven by anticipation and tactical instinct, followed, moving away from the primary node. Mercer completed the interface on the shielded vent panel. Full access achieved. The hub blinked, energy shields recalibrating, microdrones and automated turrets entering temporary lockdown under Mercer's control. He overrode targeting vectors remotely, feeding false coordinates, kinetic pulses, and delayed telemetry back into the enemy network. The infiltrator's instruments detected anomalies. He realized too late that he had been deceived. Faint hiss announced the activation of a secondary defensive measure, a collapsing kinetic grid designed to trap intruders. Mercer had predicted this. He triggered lateral micro-EMP pulses, temporarily neutralizing the grid, and sprinted toward the extraction point with the girl. Voss covered with precision pulses, suppressing automated defenses and forcing the infiltrator to retreat toward the northern ridge. Mercer's heart pounded as they navigated the final descent toward safe ground. The girl clutched his vest tightly, eyes wide but unbroken. Every meter of sand, every shadowed depression, had been a battle of wits, skill, and discipline. They emerged from the canyon to an open plateau temporary safety, but Mercer knew the infiltrator would not give up. A final engagement awaited on the northern ridge. Mercer, Voss, and Cade coordinated silently, signals and gestures replacing words. Mercer edged into firing position, micro-MP module in hand. The infiltrator appeared at the ridge crest, realizing the trap too late. Mercer released a calibrated pulse. Energy shields flickered. The infiltrator stumbled, optics blinded. Voss fired a suppression pulse, driving him further from the node. Cade deployed kinetic microtraps along retreat paths. The infiltrator's tactical advantage collapsed. He fell back, trapped between terrain, suppression fields, and controlled deception. Mercer's calm, calculated approach had turned the enemy's predictive strength into vulnerability. The girl's hand brushed against his chest. "We win?" she whispered. Mercer's eyes scanned the horizon. The node was fully under their control. Enemy sensors were disrupted. Microdrones grounded. Predictive algorithms now fed false data back into the network. "We've won the battle," he said softly. "But the war?" He glanced at Voss and Cade. "We've learned, adapted, and survived. That's the doctrine that carries forward?" The plateau fell silent. The desert stretched endlessly, but now it bore a different reality. Human grit, tactical discipline, and improvisation had overcome machine calculation and deception. The infiltrator had retreated, wounded in strategic terms, but alive a warning and a lesson. Mercer lowered the girl gently. She looked around, breathing steady now, the terror replaced by cautious curiosity. Cade confirmed extraction coordinates. Voss scanned for remaining threats. The team had sustained minor injuries, but all critical assets were intact. Mercer studied the node's control interface one last time. Patterns of patrol, energy allocation, and tactical reinforcement now belonged to them. They had used discipline, coordination, and sacrifice, not luck, to achieve victory. The desert had demanded precision, and they had delivered as the sun climbed higher. The first light illuminating sand and rock, Mercer reflected on cost and consequence. Lives had been risked, trust tested, improvisation demanded. They had faced betrayal, deadly adaptation, and relentless odds, and survived through intelligence, strategy, and courage. The girl, silent but present, finally spoke, voice steady. "White man, forgive?" Mercer knelt beside her, placing a gloved hand on her shoulder. "Not here," he said, voice firm but gentle. "Not today. But we've learned what it means to survive, to adapt, and to protect. That's what counts." Voss and Cade approached, scanning the horizon for lingering threats. The plateau, once a potential kill zone, now symbolized control, awareness, and human ingenuity. The infiltrator had been outmaneuvered, nodes secured, enemy coordination disrupted, and yet Mercer knew the desert and its shadows remained unpredictable. The war would continue in different forms, with new strategies, tactics, and threats. But for now, they had proven the principle: disciplined strategy, human intelligence, and adaptive improvisation could overcome even the most calculated, lethal systems. The girl's small hand slid into Mercer's.